How the rheostat changed my life could have been the title of my talk today, but it isn't. And it isn't because the way the rheostat changed my life is not what we might normally think. But let me explain. I grew up in Ghana and went to secondary school there at a time when I think the almost universal conviction was that the only way you could escape, and I'm emphasizing that the word, the only way you could escape from a life of manual hard labor was to be an educated person. And the way to be an educated person, a well-educated person, is to accumulate a lot of knowledge about a bunch of stuff. And not only to accumulate it, but to display it. And preferably, you would do this without the benefit of any experience. And even sometimes with a measure of disdain for people who work with their hands to make things. So the emphasis was on the accumulation and display of knowledge. Now, to be really well educated, obviously you had to go to university. And to get to the university, you had to pass these exams from secondary school, which were not set by your school or your country or your region, but they were set in the United Kingdom by universities and other test authorities there. Now, that's where my relationship with the rheostat started. Now, I was taking physics, and to pass the physics test, what most students would do, and it was not just the physics test, is get samples of past exams and memorize the questions and memorize the answers that they thought would show up on the test. And so, one of the most often asked questions that we saw was, describe a rheostat in detail. And then there will be a couple of quantitative questions. So I got really good at describing a rheostat. I knew how to do that really well. But just imagine this. I had never seen one. I had never used one. And actually, I couldn't really imagine fully what it was. It was very vague, but I knew how to describe one. So, fast forward a couple of years, a group of friends of mine, just because we were bored on a Sunday night, decided to run away from school to go take an exam for a scholarship we really did not intend to accept. But as luck may have it, several of us won the scholarship to go to the United States, so I ended up as a student in a college in the United States. And not being able to decide which course of study I was going to take, I was going to do the maximum, so I decided to go into chemistry and mechanical engineering. And one of my first lab courses, I finally came face to face with the object of my long fascination, the rheostat. Now, I was so profoundly disappointed. So this is the thing that I have been studying for hours and hours and hours, and I thought it was the coolest thing. This is the rheostat. And for those of us who want to go search for it, please don't waste your time. It's simply the principle on which your light dimmers work. They just went up, just like that. That's all. Now, what I realized then, that the pursuit that we had been on to accumulate knowledge, and what we had accumulated was not really knowledge, because I never had really understood the rheostat I had not understood the context in which it was used, and I had not really understood that at the same time that I was spending all my time looking at this, there was an explosion of scientific breakthroughs in electronics, an explosion of discoveries, an explosion of inventions. So that was the first doubt I had about our system of acquiring knowledge. But the first doubt does not necessarily change your path. So I went on, and having been trained at some point in English and French and even dead languages like Latin and Greek, I continued chemistry, mechanical engineering. I went to graduate school and aerospace engineering, rheology, food engineering, religion and philosophy, all of those things, just acquiring knowledge. But the second signal that I might have been on my way to a personal tipping point happened after I left college, and I went to work with an engineering firm that was a defense contractor, and I had been assigned to design a brake and clutch system for a military vehicle. And I sat down at my table, and I designed what I thought was the most beautiful looking brake and clutch system. And I called my boss, and I said, "Look at this," with pride. And he must have looked at it for less than 15 seconds. And he said to me, "Follow me." So where are we going? So we're going to go to the shop, and you're going to make it. Well, I was totally humiliated because what John, and I do remember his name, John Liu was his name. And it was that very long ago, but I remember his name. Because what was clear was that my design was pretty on paper, but it couldn't be made. So what good is it to have this pretty design that couldn't be made? That is the start of the reinforcement to me that just accumulating information or facts or quote-unquote knowledge about something without having an engagement or a relationship of doing with it was not worth very much. In any way, my ego was crushed, and it didn't take long before I left, and I went to graduate school, where I could do the thing that I really liked doing, accumulating knowledge. So towards the end of my doctorate studies, I had announced to a friend that I was just about to accept an offer to go to another country and to study yet another subject. And the friend said, "Well, you know what? You are one of those people who would be a perpetual student because you are afraid to go out there and get a real job." And again, my pride was wounded. So I said, "Okay, I'm going to prove to you and myself that I'm going to go get a real job." And in a relatively short time, to my own surprise, I got one. I got one at a company that needed somebody who understood chemistry and aerodynamics. Perfect. So I went to work, and it didn't take long for me to realize that I couldn't use the same kinds of assumptions I had used as a student at work. And I couldn't take an infinite amount of time trying to do analysis. I had to make decisions, and I had to act on them. And there was a lot of money involved. So if I messed up, there were consequences. Not the kinds of things that I was doing in academia. But the best thing I learned was I really loved this stuff. I really liked it. I liked it beyond anything that I thought I would. And I used to think that the life in academia was the most important thing and the most sophisticated work. I learned out there, when you're designing things that somebody's going to use, there are real consequences, and I was intellectually a lot more challenged doing that work. In any case, I gained some notoriety. I was somewhat successful, and I started to give speeches. And people wanted you to come and talk about this and about that and about things that I probably shouldn't have been talking about. At some point, and in fact, during one speech, my personal tipping point really happened. In the middle of the speech, I started to lose my place, and I said, what am I doing? I was writing, it was like I was writing prescriptions for what other people should do, what governments in Africa should do to get people going, and so on. And I was making all these speeches about what I was not doing, and what my friends were not doing was to actually get engaged in doing, as opposed to analyzing and criticizing. So from that point of view, from that day, I decided to do a lot more and to give fewer speeches. So you can imagine my initial ambivalence when I was invited to come here and speak. Now, I've made my peace with it because what I'm doing, I'm told, is just sharing, and I'm not lecturing. So I hope that's okay. So, in looking at this in terms of what we should do, or what I should be doing to advance the cause of humanity, and getting engaged more in doing than in just talking or analyzing, I realized that a lot of the giants of history who have made contributions to us have not just been analysts. They have been doers. Starting right here, there is what Western people call Avicenna, the Persian scholar Avicenna or Ibn Sina, who was not content just to be a great scholar who observed. He actually got involved, and I learned that he was the father of aromatherapy, but he also wrote the book of medicine, which guided medical practice in Europe for hundreds of years, actually. Or Leonardo da Vinci, who seemed to have a pathological urge to build what he imagined. Or people in politics, Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Nkrumah and Azikiwe and Kenyatta of Africa, all of these were people who put their doing on the line, risked failure to make things happen. So we have a legacy, a history to stand on, that doers actually can or should be major instruments for our transformation. Now, those are not the only ones. I don't want to suggest that only people in politics or science do. There are many in the arts who create. And when we talk about doing, we are talking about creation. And it takes doing to create. So, how does all of this relate to the issues of poverty in the world? First, I think we should all try to understand our own metaphorical rheostats and the context of their use a lot better than I did. So that writing prescriptions from 6,000 miles away to people with whom we do not engage and that we don't understand in situations that we have no contact is going to fail. I think we have a lot of evidence of that. And I think the people who are advocates of design thinking would say that if you are not engaged, if you are not gaining empathy, if you are not involved, you are not going to have the most creative solutions to the problems of humanity. The second thing that I think we should be thinking about is educational systems that do not separate the life of the mind from the life of the hands. As I began to think about this, I actually saw many, many examples and institutions that practice the combination, the integration of thought, knowledge, and doing. I just observed, as an example, Stanford University has a program a facility called the Product Realization Lab, and they had a beautiful tagline. It says, transforming thinking by doing. Transforming thinking by doing. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology has on its insignia a motto that says, and you'll pardon the Latin quote, mens and manus, the mind and the hands together. So why is it that in many developing countries, we got to the point where we separate the people that we think are smart into academic tracks, and the people that we think are not smart into vocational training? Let's imagine a world in which we can bring those two together. I want to cite an example of a little work that was done in West Africa by people from the institute that I used to head at Stanford with secondary school students. These were top secondary school students who could probably do calculus very well and write some differential equations. And when we asked them in the design thinking exercise, when they came into the room, are you creative? Maybe 1 or 2 out of 30 would say that they're creative. After a 1-hour exercise where they had to build crude prototypes of whatever ideas they thought they had, that number changed tremendously. And it is by doing that they realized that they had better potential than they thought. Now, doing has risks, of course, because doing exposes you to the risk of failure. But if we don't have the courage to do, we cannot create. And creation is important to the advancement of the cause of humanity. So I'd like to close with what I would like to imagine as a future world where I would be willing to do to make happen. A world in which when we send our children to school, they are going to school not to escape hard work or manual work, but they are going to school to do something. A world in which our educational system doesn't separate the hands from the mind, and that, in fact, our most talented people get involved with doing, and that they are encouraged and celebrated to do. And a life in which people who are less fortunate and maybe are not from the wealthy wealthy countries can also create, because in their creation will be the enrichment of the world. Just imagine what would happen if we are getting innovations and creations from all parts of the globe, where all of our ideas and all of our creations are valued. Just imagine what that would do to lower the temperature of the dissatisfied. So, I'm really excited about the future, and I am going to try to do more to make that happen. I hope to see you there. Thanks.